Let's have a sesh on scientific and intuitive decision making. We'll start firstly with scientific decision making. So scientific decision making is simply using data to aid your decision making. So managers' decisions will be used and based on data. Now you might want to follow an iterative process as so, which is that you might want to first up set your objectives. You set your objectives of what you're trying to achieve, what you hope the outcome would be. Then you would gather data to try and help you then analyse that data. And once you've analysed that data, it could be market research, you would look to select the appropriate decision, select the best decision that will meet those objectives. Once you've done that, you've selected that decision, you need to implement that decision, you need to make it reality, put it into practice. And once you've put it into practice, you will then get outcomes. And that is where the review check comes in. So the review check is that you would take those outcomes and you would compare those outcomes to what the original objectives were. And if there is a gap between what the original objective was and what the outcome is, well then you could go through this whole process again and again and again until they equal each other, hence the iterative approach. Now the advantages of doing this, number one, it's a logical process. So a logical process is very rational, it's a very sensible way of tackling a decision. It's based on data. And because it's based on data, that clearly will reduce the risk of failure. Failure could be waste. It could be waste in terms of wasted finance, wasted staff time, wasted supplies, wasted raw materials, components. Whatever the decision is, waste is hopefully going to be reduced or even better eliminated from making leaner decisions through scientific approaches as so. The second advantage of scientific decision making is you've got this review check in place. The review check means you're constantly checking against the original objectives. Those original objectives could be the mission statement, the corporate objectives, the function objectives, and within that, you are therefore keeping aligned and coordinated with the overall schema of the business, what the actual plan is for the business, which is why it's excellent to have that review check, which you don't have on the other side, as we get to. The last thing to think about is if you need to get buy-in with certain players, and you might want to think about stakeholder mapping here. With stakeholder mapping, if you've got high power, high influence stakeholders, you might need to get their buy-in to make that decision. You need to get their agreement before it can happen, before it can be implemented. Well, if you're doing that decision based on scientific approaches and you've used data, it's more likely they're going to agree, and that's what you want. So it might make sense to do that in that case. Now, there's disadvantages with doing scientific decision making. The first, because you put in all these steps and you put in that review check process, clearly it's slower. It's slower than the alternative, which is making a hunch decision through intuition. Clearly it's more expensive because it's going to involve more labour involved, more time involved as you go through the process. But maybe that's in the short term, because in the long term, if you make a poor decision, you'll get those wasted resources. Other things to think about is you just need to be aware of any historical data that's incorrect, like where's this data coming from? Is it right? Is it accurate? Is it volatile? Is it any form of prediction for the future? And also, is there any bias that's happened in the analysed data stage? Now, on the other side is intuitive approach. So an intuitive approach is simply just using a gut feeling or a hunch to make that decision. Number one of why it's an advantage, it's quicker in doing that decision-making process. It could make sense if you're in a competitive market and you're looking to get first mover advantage. You might want to do an intuitive approach. Also, if you're a business in crisis, we've seen lots of businesses in crisis in the recent health crisis, it might be they just need to make a quick and effective decision for the survival of the business. They haven't got time to go through these steps. That's when it will make sense. It will also be a more effective decision, or likely anyway, if you've got an experienced manager who's made lots of decisions in the past, because if you've got that person, then they might be able to make intuitive decisions that are effective. There's a risk though. There's likely to be a higher risk than using this because you're not basing intuitive decisions on any form of data. It's not gone through this check process. So therefore, it might actually be harder to justify the decision to those key players if you need those buy-in. The key things to think about is like, if you're going to do this, you're doing it because you're trying to get ahead as quickly as possible, or you're in a crisis, or maybe you don't need to sell that idea to anyone. Now, things to think about. If you get a case study about scientific versus intuition in terms of decision making, well, number one is how quickly that decision needs to be made. If it needs to be made in a really quick time, then clearly it needs to be on this side. If you've got all the time in the world and you've got the finances to cope with it, or maybe a scientific approach makes more sense. You might also want to question how trustworthy or accurate the data is, because if it's not, then the whole of scientific decision making is blown out. It doesn't make sense if you can't trust the data. So the data is absolutely critical. Other things to think about is that you have decided that you want to do one of these approaches. Well, any decision, regardless of its scientific or an intuitive approach, any decision has got risk attached. Risk attached, but clearly rewards attached in place, which is where decision trees may make sense. See the playlist for more details on that. Also, uncertainty may always exist in any decision. We've seen that in the health crisis this year. It massively had like a complete uncertainty in terms of any business expected in that to happen. And the last thing to think about is within any decision, there's always going to be opportunity. There's opportunity cost involved. There's always going to be a sacrifice. More details on that, click the card up there. Anyway, hope that helps. I'll see you at the next sesh.